Thank you for joining us for this Hagley History Hangout. I am Gregory Hargreaves, Program Officer in the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library. And I am being joined today by Zachary Mann, a PhD candidate in English Literature at the University of Southern California, where we will be talking about his dissertation project titled The Punch Card Imagination, Authorship and Early Computing History, for which Zach has received support from in the form of an exploratory research grant from the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society. And his project, Mann reconsiders the development of punch card computing technology in light of contemporary literature, from parallels between the Jacquard, loom, and Romanticism to the uses of punch card computing by authors and artists in the mid-20th century. This interdisciplinary history suggests new approaches to knowledge and cultural production aided by computers today and in the past. Zachary, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
It's great. Let's start sort of with the fundamentals of your project. What is a punch card and why is it significant to the history of computers?
Yeah, well, the classic story of the history of the punch card, as many materials in the Hagley kind of confirm, is that the kind of classic IBM punch card that we know that was kind of at its height in the 1960s. The very simple idea of it as being a piece of cardboard with holes in it to program a machine was invented in 18th century France in the textile industry, in a certain form of it at least, for automating looms to create to repeat certain kinds of weaving patterns over and over. And that's essentially it. You just feed these cards with holes in it through a Jacquard harness, as it eventually became known, and it would tell the loom where to lift the warp or not lift the warp and create its patterns. And nowadays, computer history tend to look back on that as kind of a predecessor of the computer punch card, through kind of a indirect process in the 19th century.
So the card was a means of storing information such that a machine could read it.
Precisely, yeah. It's it alongside the kind of cylinder they use for like player pianos,
Oh, sure.
teletape, and things like that. These are all kind of predecessors of that kind of first machine programming. Is what I'm looking at.
Well, what is the connection there with contemporary literature?
So my project, and I am a literature program, so I'm focusing on literature. My project is while these punch cards, while these looms and other such early innovations are normally studied as like stepping stones to the computer, or like part of this teleology of what became computer programming. I'm interested in kind of like what these actually meant in their day, which is often not talked about, apart from like maybe some economic effects. But I'm looking at the kind of the effects on culture production. And what I'm looking at is like as simultaneous to these looms being developed in the 18th century, you had in literature and culture production, art production, visual arts, music, you have a lot of artists starting to imagining what it'd be like to automate creativity. So it's pretty rough in the 18th century, but as it develops, as the Jacquard loom is invented in 1804, then you have kind of literary romanticism and how they start considering kind of the future of the author, the future of the artist, in the memory of the public and the memory of canon, and how that's getting threatened by this idea that now art manufacture, even visual arts and art, are starting to be developed without the artist present. And then you have Charles Babbage's analytical engine and his translator Ada Lovelace start actually even more further imagining what this kind of punch card system and other kinds of machine automation might do to the future of culture production, right? So Babbage is interested in calculators, but Ada Lovelace is actually interested in what it might mean for music and art. So I'm looking at that as well.
So was the initial reaction from writers, artists, and thinkers to be threatened, or perhaps also to see the possibilities?
My argument is definitely there's a little measure of both. There's definitely a lot of initial negative reactions. Jonathan Swift, kind of when I first subject matter there. But then as you go, artists start thinking of themselves as like, we are the chief content operators of our own careers, and we are a firm in ourselves. And that's kind of what I'm looking at now in the 19th century.
Well, how does that play out?
Right. So that instead of the obsession with having the kind of representation of the author's labor, like, I wrote this, you can tell because, I'm talking about myself with a pen in my hand. Like I'm proving that this is my private property. So I can like satisfy the legal ramifications of what private property, how it's invented by, the kind of the Lockean idea of it. It's just from that to thinking about, I don't need to like really actually be there writing it. I just need to have like my name, my brand, my persona on the page strong enough that it doesn't really matter who I am personally, as long as kind of I have this other author in the world apart from myself. And I'm kind of looking at how that is similar to the idea that punch card and other types of storage of creativity are considering the idea that creativity can be stored outside of the author themselves and reactivated on the page, reactivated else afterward after they're dead. There's kinds of new ideas, I'm arguing at least, about cultural production.
It reminds me a little bit of the workshops that master painters would have, where they would have numerous people working under them, effectively copying their work or doing work that, as you say, had a strong enough resemblance to be branded as a Rembrandt, for example.
Precisely. Rembrandt would often farm out his like actual execution of his work to like teams of journeymen, as they would be called. Yeah.
Are there examples then in letters?
In my project is mostly looking at it kind of more theoretical. Like, so I'm looking more at kind of the practice of imposture in the 19th century and forgeries. And when you think about authors, how we think about them today as like a collection of works that are both fake and real, like both forgeries and not the reputation kind of very publicly created. How that might be similar to the literal use of a team to paint your paintings, and just the relationship between the publisher and the author, and it kind of works out at a different kind of division of labor, even though it's not as literal as some visual arts and music is.
What collections at Hagley have you looked at?
So Hagley has this great collection of 19th century American kind of history of the punch card. You kind of have industrialists coming over here in the like 1830s and 40s, 20s as well. They have a collection from William Horstman, which he was the first one to bring over the Jacquard loom to the U.S., to Philadelphia. You have someone named Jenks, who I'm kind of maybe not collecting right now, but who was a kind of innovator of the first power loom in America in 1830. And now I was looking kind of their materials, and their sort of, they like computer historians today like to think of themselves as like the end result of a evolution of innovations. So they like to look back on Jacquard as a kind of figure in their history. And that's even repeated again when you have Hagley also has Austrian's collections of Halderith's, who's invented the punch card for the US Census and then founded IBM, and how he also, or people writing about him, also imagined the Jacquard loom as kind of a predecessor to the IBM punch card. So I'm kind of very much looking at that kind of the more mythological history of the punch card through time. Hagley was very great at like drawing those connections between especially Europe and America, which I was definitely interested in looking at. And one of the coolest things they had, some of the coolest things they have a bunch of a trade magazine called the Punch Card Annual, which talks about the punch card in its like early 20th century, and they kind of have like sections of history where they explain their own history, which is mostly false but very interesting. And then Horstman, for the centennial in 1876, produced one of my projects really interested in is the really complex art woven in silk using the automated loom. that's my argument, is like showing how fine art can be done in automation. And there's some great stuff in France, much more fine than stuff we're looking at in Philadelphia. But Horstman did, for the centennial, produce a silk woven image of Independence Hall, which the Hagley has. It's only like maybe this big, but it is pretty fascinating to kind of look at and just kind of see the machine weaving in the 19th century.
Was it able to approach the quality of a non-automated product?
The Jacquard loom certainly was able to in the 19th century. This item is maybe less so. It kind of looks, I don't know it looks like more like what do you call it, a pillow, the kind of like a decorative pillow. It looks more like that. But yeah, so I don't know how many punch cards that one used, but some of the other ones done in France around the same time were using something around 80,000, 100,000 punch cards to make one single design.
Wow.
My guess is the one that the Horstmans used was probably more around like 10,000 in terms of just like fineness of weaving.
It's amazing that it introduces this ability to sort of quantify, what would we say, creativity, or even creative density.
Interesting, creative density. Yeah, yeah. They're one of the kind of the famous quotes. You have kind of the arts and craft movement in the late 19th century, and you have they kind of take on John Ruskin's writing. And one of the quotes that I like, I love of his, is that no machine will ever approach the subtlety of the human hand. Subtlety of the human hand will always like, kind of be king in the artistic departments. But my argument is that, like, if you look at some of these silk woven pieces, they're indistinguishable from engraving,
Wow.
and it's quite impressive. Yeah.
Mm.
There is even a prayer book made in France in I think 1888, a full book of just with words. All of it is just woven by machine, and it's quite impressive.
Wow. Well, how are you able to use the materials you accessed at Hagley for your project? How are they able to advance your understanding?
The biggest, as I mentioned, the biggest thing was just giving me this kind of grand narrative to work with, to work against, to kind of look at the history as it's being made, because that was a big thing. Is I'm relying on these computer histories written in the last 20 years, and they are not always. A lot of the history of the 19th century they are leaning on is really for them just a footnote or a couple of pages. But this interesting was like looking at the history of the punch card as it was being made in the 19th century, as it was being formed. And that's kind of what I want to write against as I'm talking, especially when I start talking about Babbage in the kind of the mid 19th century. A chapter.
It is an important methodological question whether you read history forward or read it backward. And it sounds like you're doing the important work of reading it forward.
Yeah, precisely. I don't want to fall into the kind of classic history of technology trope. You don't want to fall into the trap of just kind of building on this long history of what people have said the last 5 years ago, and and it tends to be kind of presentist in its motivation, right? So I definitely want, and this is what I'm told by my committee, and often told, it's kind of more primary sources. So I'm looking, what Hagley is really giving me is a kind of a wealth of primary sources to wrestle with as I kind of deal with this kind of histories I've read and histories that I like assume, which has been challenging to look at these kind of self fashioning of these 19th century historians and industrialists.
Did the advent of computing technology change literature?
This is a section of my project that I have not quite reached, but but certainly you have there's an argument to be made that kind of the moment in the 60s and 70s when literature kind of announces the death of the author coincides with the kind of the rise of the computer in some interesting ways. And my project specifically focuses on, as a kind of example, I focus on J.M. Coetzee, the South African novelist who worked at IBM in London before leaving to have a literary career. First, he went to UT Austin and studied Beckett, Samuel Beckett, and like tried to solve Samuel Beckett as if Samuel Beckett was a computer, kind of create a bunch of matrices and computer programs to try and solve Beckett, and then went on to become a, kind of a cherished novelist. So I'm looking at his 60s and 70s career and what he was thinking about literature through the computer, to talk about how all the questions being raised in the 19th century about how we define creativity, how we identify who the author is still being challenged by the kind of the question that Coetzee is asking about who is the author of Beckett's prose work. Is it this interesting man Beckett, or is it a mathematical equation, is what he is looking for. And that kind of like question of who is the author at the center of literary history in general, constantly being challenged by these technological innovations that we mostly ignore as a discipline.
Well, for those of us, such as myself, unfamiliar with the concept, what is the death of the author, or in the mid-20th century?
It is just the idea that when we're reading literature, we no longer really necessarily like are looking at the book's past, the real life of the author before the book. We're looking at the author as it's being invented for us on the page. We're looking at we're using the word Shakespeare as a way to identify a collection of works, not to talk about a person named William Shakespeare. So it's kind of shifting from this idea that we're studying humans, great men normally, right? Who have the intent to write literature and are carried out. We're now looking at just what texts are doing, what books are doing, how they behave in our culture, not so much how the people are. And that's kind of the big shift that happens around the same time that computing really enters the personal sphere.
That's fascinating. So I also see the parallel there. So it's a new emphasis on documentary analysis. And that, of course, is an important technique in doing history. And so it makes sense that if this is how you're going to study literature, that bringing in the primary source foundation to set them in conversation is quite important.
Yeah, the real challenge for me is I'm making these claims, and also I'm looking at kind of the personal lives of these people in the 18th and 19th century to see where they encountered such and such machine in their lives. So I'm kind of mixing kind of both, and it takes a little bit of imagination, hopefully not too much on my part.
Well, are there any implications from your work that you could draw for our society that is saturated with computing technology and computing capacity?
Yeah, a good question. I guess my my hope is that what I'm doing is obviously not in itself a correction to, but a part of a new way of talking about computer history that is bringing more of the humanities into it, and is hopefully leaning less on some of the more, we call it bracketing out of culture that much of technology history includes. So I mean, obviously history of technology has incorporated the social history of technology, cultural history of technology quite a bit in the last 25 years. But I'm hoping to kind of add to that, to bring more of the humanities in encountering with that history, to kind of open that up and kind of further challenge some of the more like Enlightenment roots of the computer, to show how it's not just grown kind of objectively throughout the last 3 centuries, but has been a lot of stops and starts and interesting encounters where who knows what has influenced the invention of the computer more than just a couple of scientists in their labs, right?
Sure. Of course, there's an important element in the history of technology about the consumer or the end user. Mm-hmm. And in this case, if the end user is an author, that does quite complicate the production of culture done through the machine.
Yeah, and I would argue, although I haven't quite made the argument yet, that kind of loops back into the further innovations of the machine. The kind of all the imagined uses of the machine end up influencing its later innovation.
The sort of classic example being in the popular imagination being Star Trek, where
Precisely.
right, communicators sparked the idea of wireless communication in different ways.
Precisely, or as simple as the typewriter being invented for first, you know, perhaps for some disability, and then after that for like stenographers, but once authors then started to imagine themselves as like the godlike figures on their own, like creating new worlds with their fingers, the typewriter became more and more designed for actual people to use on their own, you know, perfectly able people to use on their own. So interesting way that's also shifted the typewriter history as well.
To your knowledge, was there a similar process for word processing?
I imagine so, but that's definitely outside my purview.
Well, Zach, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I can't wait to read your project when it's all said and done.
I look forward to finishing it, to be honest. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the Hagley for all that great materials and, you know, great location.
Absolutely. And for the audience, if you'd like more information about the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, the Hagley Museum and Library, or the Hagley History Hangout program, go to our website. That's hagley.org, hagley.org. And Zach, thanks you once again.
Thank you.